Hey, welcome members. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, some places. We are starting our session. I will introduce Professor Elizabeth Robinson, and for the keynote speaker for today. Elizabeth Robinson is an environmental economist with over 25 years experience undertaking research, particularly in low-income countries, including 6 while living in Tanzania and Ghana. Her research addresses the design of policies, institutions to reduce climate change emission, protect the environment, improve the livelihood of resource-dependent communities. Her recent focus includes climate change and the systematic risk, tracking the core benefit of climate change mitigation and health, oriented particularly around food security and the food system. From 2004 to 2009, she was coordinating lead author for the International Assessment of Agricultural Science and Technology for Development in Sub-Saharan Africa, and a member of the Global and Sub-Saharan Africa Design Team. She was in the UK DAFRA Economics Advisory Panel for 5 years, and the 2019-2020 Specialist Advisor to the UK House of Lords Select Committee on Food, Poverty, Health and Environment. She is in Working Group 1, lead for the recent countdown that addresses climate change impacts, exposure and vulnerability. Before joining the Graham Research Institute at London School of Economics in 2021, Professor Elizabeth Robinson worked at the University of Reading for 10 years. Prior to that, she was variously worked at the Boston Consulting Group, the World Bank, Rockefeller Foundation, Natural Resource Institute, and as a tutorial fellow in economics at the University of Oxford. Professor Elizabeth Robinson research interested particularly on the design of environment and policy instrument, climate change and health, climate change and food security. That's Elizabeth Robinson. And I welcome you, Professor Elizabeth Robinson, for this panelist today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Razak. And most important, I've been working with you for over 15 years now. I think we're coming up to 18, which is probably the most important thing. So thank you so much for inviting me to give a keynote. I can't see the list of who's participating, but I suspect I know a lot of people. And those of you who know me might be just waiting for me to put a bunch of equations up, talking about forests. But actually, I'm going to talk about an area of work that I've been sort of dipping in and out of for a while, and I'm spending quite a lot of my time on now, which is food security, and what I've called food security is sort of in an era of climate insecurity. So if all goes to plan, you should now be seeing my screen, and I assume I'll get a message if you're not. So I'm going to assume that you can all hear me and that you can all see my screen. So again, yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to talk for about sort of 25 minutes, which will give about 20 minutes for questions. So what I'll just go over today, I first just want to talk a little bit about weather and whether our understanding of climate change has changed our understanding of food insecurity. Give a definition of food security so we're all on the same page. And just maybe potentially called 3 moments in time and thought, but 3 sort of aspects of food insecurity and how the discussion, the optics as well of climate change and food insecurity have changed. And then just a little bit of looking into the future. And I thought, you know, because this is an EfD meeting, I would sort of try to think about and stimulate some discussion in a way about the so what for environmental economists. So, excuse me, like I said, just one definition, which is the sort of, most of us have probably seen this, it's the classic FAO coming out of sort of 2002. And the definition which many of us use in our work is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social and economic access to food that meets dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And I think what's important is there's a real emphasis on consumption, there's a real emphasis on the demand side, and there's a real emphasis on issues of access, particularly for vulnerable people. And so it's not just about calories at the right time. And implicit is actually explicitly emphasized. And so it's sort of about access and availability, and is there food, and is it in the right place, and can people afford to purchase it? And I just put a few photos. The first ones are from the Ethiopia famine when I was young, and you know, the optics were very much about sort of starving African children and starving African livestock. And the bottom photo is, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, is far more what the visuals and the optics were like during the food crisis of 2008. And that was basically rioting on the streets, often in urban areas, because people couldn't afford food. And I'm going to try and link that a little bit to climate change. So, so 3 moments in time and thought. So the first one, there's just one slide on this. So I just wanted to take this quote from Amartya Sen, who said that no famine's ever taken place in the history of the world in a functioning democracy. And the idea behind this is that without full information, if we don't have a free press, if markets aren't functioning, we kind of lose that price signaling to ensure that grain or food moves from lower to higher price areas. And so I did sneak one equation in, but basically the arbitrage conditions are breached. And so, you know, the arbitrage conditions simply say that if the price differential between food in one location and food in the other is greater than the transport cost, then we would expect that trade to occur. And so there was a sort of, I think we can sort of say that certainly in the 80s and 90s, there was a trust in markets. So, you know, we don't really need to have large food stocks. We don't need to think of self-sufficiency, but actually it's more efficient to produce food where it's most efficient and then buy efficient, and we can reduce those inefficient storage and stocks. So I think there was a quite strong narrative about trust in markets. And then 2008 came along, and we started sort of, and I think this has sort of been building up over the last 2 decades. There's been far more awareness of the potential of systemic crisis. And basically, when we have climate change and when we have increasingly integrated markets, we see an increasing risk of systemic crisis. And I'm going to talk about systemic crisis in the context of food and the increasingly interlinked food systems across the globe. But there's been examples of systemic crises in terms of just-in-time car production in Thailand that was disrupted by storms. If we think about hurricanes hitting the southern states of the United States of America, we've seen systemic crisis there when you get this sort of ripple effect from one sector to another. And so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the 2008 food crisis. And on the one hand, there are many stories about it, but the narrative that sort of I've sort of picked up on and sort of developed myself and talk about quite a lot is about, let's think, started. And the crisis really started with sequential wheat harvest stocks in Australia, which is a breadbasket country. And so what we can see on the first graph on the left is that yields have been increasing in Australia. And in part, we can attribute that to climate change in the context of carbon dioxide fertilization in the atmosphere. And then in the 2000s, we various reasons, including heat, and we start to see far more negative shocks. And so if you take a sort of look through the literature, you do start to pick up on reading any of the literature up to about 1990, we're seeing those positive benefits of climate change, and anything past about 1990, we start to pick up on those negative impacts of climate change, both on yields and on the fact that we're more likely to see these harvest shocks. And as a consequence, and I'll talk through sort of why it happened in this way, but as a consequence, what we can see on the right-hand side is wheat prices in orange and rice prices in blue. There's sort of a not really doing much between sort of January 2000 and 2008. And then all of a sudden the price spikes. And the shock is in the wheat market in Australia, but the real impact is felt in the rice market. And one of the consequences was rioting in Haiti, half a world away, and the prime minister being ousted there. And I think it's interesting, when I was teaching this at Reading, I would sort of talk about what we all experienced in 2008 during that food crisis. And I was like, honestly, I don't remember it. It just passed me by. And then one of my Cameroonian students would say that actually she was going to school with her mum and they were taking the bus. And her mother was like, you know, this doesn't look safe. I think you should stay home and not go to school, because there was, you know, sense of rioting happening there. So clearly, you know, the experience of the 2008 food crisis for, you know, someone living in a sort of middle class life in a higher income country, where, you know, food is not really a large part of our income, was very different from poor people living in countries where, you know, a lot of their income is spent on food. So this is a slide I just put together to sort of, I called it the anatomy of a 21st century food crisis, but I think this is more and more what we need to be concerned about in a way with food crisis, with climate change and systemic risk. And what we can do is we can track what the triggers were, why we got this amplification of the initial trigger, and sort of what was happening. And so I sort of looked first at the long-term trends that were occurring before the crisis. And so we can see that world grain stocks were falling as days of consumption. So that's really a measure of, if all food production ends today, how much food is there on the planet? And there was enough to feed, just sort of up to 2008, there was enough to feed people for 60 days and no more. So we can feel a tightening of the markets. Also during the early 2000s, there was a lot of diversion of food. So a lot of diversion of grain to cars and a lot of diversion of grain to cows. And so there was more pressure on food markets and upwards pressure on prices. And then there was the shock, or what we might call the trigger. And what we know with climate change is these triggers are going to be more frequent. And this trigger was occurred in Australia. So we see these sequential shocks in the wheat market, makes the markets nervous. After the shock, and that's due to climate change, we get the responses. And this is the socioeconomic signals. And so what we found was countries and individuals start to hoard, start to constrict, start to not want to export food. And as one country after another starts to talk about, so you don't even have to put the export restrictions on, even just talking about those export restrictions, prices start to creep higher. Why do the rice prices go up so much more rapidly? Rice is a very thin market. So a very small proportion of rice production is actually traded. So even though the crisis was in wheat, the response was in many different countries. And then the crisis ends when there's record harvests, people stop hoarding food, people stop panic buying, governments get rid of export bans, and everything kind of goes back to normal. And so what we found there was, you know, which were the countries that were where food insecurity was the biggest problem? Arguably, and you know, one can manipulate the data a little. Hungary, relatively unstable, import-dependent countries were particularly vulnerable to systemic crisis. So yes, we saw a lot of impacts of the 2008 food crisis in African countries, but we saw particularly impacts also in small Caribbean islands, which are particularly dependent on imports. And if we look at Haiti as an example, that's one of the countries in the Caribbean that has a relatively high dependency on cereal imports, relatively high political instability, and relatively high undernutrition. And so what we found was across the globe, this threat of food shortages leading to hoarding and panic buying, and export bans threatened or actual. We had a result of what's individually rational behavior. If you see food running out, you go and buy it, leading to sort of the systemic crisis across the globe. And so if we think about solutions, I'm not sure, it depends how big a screen you're looking at. I can read this slide, but I'm not sure if you can. I've got a nice big screen in front of me. But if we start to look at solutions, how do we deal with systemic food crisis? So one of the approaches that I took working with Chatham House and Tsinghua University a few years ago is we started to think, what indicators can we track to try to give us hints that we might need to start being worried about climate crises? So on the one hand, the scientists are tracking those triggers of the climate risk, and we know that as emissions go up, those triggers are likely to be more frequent. So clearly climate change mitigation matters to reduce the triggers, but so long as we're not in control of that, what other opportunities are there? So we try to sort of think of a set of indicators, and we pigeonhole them into a sort of 3 by 3, but hazard indicators, exposure indicators, and vulnerability indicators at a global, national, and local level. And so, for example, just to give you a sense of what we tracked export concentration in key markets. So the less concentrated export markets are, we should think the less vulnerable they are to these systemic crises. We tracked global stock to use ratio, probably a little bit better than remaining food in days. And so the higher the global stock to use ratio, the less vulnerable the global markets are. And of course, we track global production of food. We also track global food prices, because clearly prices, within prices, they're picking up on a lot of these signals, such as diversion of grains. And then at the individual country level, we're looking at cereal import dependency. So if you look at FAO stat, one of those indicators of food insecurity is cereal import dependency. And then we started trying to track the number of countries that have the potential to put export restrictions on staple crops. And at a country level, we looked at the proportion of household spending on food consumption, and we looked at the number of countries that had that triple negative of undernourishment, instability, and import disruption. We start to see what direction these indicators are going. Anything circled green is going in the right direction to reduce the likelihood of systemic risk. Orange, not much change. Red, going in the wrong direction. And so on the solutions, we can start to think about ways that we can try to reduce the vulnerability at a global level, vulnerability of countries, and vulnerability of individuals to these shocks. And then I said sort of 3 points in time. And I feel the first point is very much about this sort of, in the past, these sort of very localized famines due to market signals not working. The second is where actually markets are highly integrated, and so you get speculation and hoarding. So the market signals and price signals work in the opposite direction, that as prices go up, people hoard and hold back grain even more. So markets are actually flipping and doing the opposite because of the high levels of integration. And then I just sort of picked up on this, that a relatively recent story on the Madagascar famine. And it's the first that's actually sort of formally been attributed to climate change. And Madagascar's only recently become sort of considered a democracy. So we might say this is only a country 3 years into democracy, but we can think back to sort of Amartya Sen's statement about, famines only really happen where there's no democracy. And so I think now we're moving into a situation where individual countries can be harmed due to climate change. We can start to try to attribute that. So markets was taking center stage in the 20th century. Early 21st century, we started to be much more aware of systemic risk, and then climate change taking center stage, arguably, this year with the famine in Madagascar. And then just something else to be thinking about is that countries with the highest increase in temperature also tend to be suffering from higher food insecurity. So if we start to think about where are those at-risk countries, we can look at the ones that are already hungry and that are already experiencing heating. And so this graph is produced by Dr. Shura Dasgupta from CMCC in Italy. And I think he's in the audience today. So if there's any technical questions on econometrics and data, he will be able to answer them. I won't be answering them. But what we're starting to do is try to look at where hotspots are emerging. And so this kind of graph, we can actually produce over time for multiple years and start to overlay food insecurity, temperature anomalies. We could also overlay political instability and start to get that sense of where we need to be most worried. And I think this diagram sort of shows that we need to start to be looking really seriously in the long run about building resilience for Southern African countries and West African countries. This is another sort of way that we can start thinking about the links between climate change and food insecurity. So one thing that if anyone was following COP, I attended the last week of COP, the second week. It was actually quite fun, depressing but fun at the same time. There was a lot of energy and a lot of positive energy. But one of the discussions was about loss and damage. And higher income countries always get nervous about loss and damage discussions, because when people start discussing loss and damage, other people will start linking this to compensation and to liability. But I think it is quite important for us, and it's interesting for us as academics, to think about whether we can actually attribute increasing food insecurity to climate change. And so again, this is work that I'm doing with Dr. Shura Dasgupta. And what we're trying to look at is the extent to which we can attribute a change in the probability of food insecurity to the temperature anomaly. So this is kind of a second differential graph. So underlying this graph, already we know that temperatures are increasing over time. But more worrying than that is the change in probability of food insecurity is actually increasing with increasing temperature. So not only can we identify and start to attribute increasing food insecurity to increasing temperatures, but also we can start to see to what extent, as temperatures increase yet more, food insecurity is an even bigger issue. And so I think, this is where there's sort of exciting work to be done, and this is all done with secondary data, and the data are available, publicly available. This is done at a global level for 83 countries, but one can start to drill down to look at what's happening for individual countries. So here's some of the data. I'm afraid it's not the greatest resolution of the graph, but again, if you want to talk about the econometrics, those who know me know not to talk to me about the econometrics. But here we're starting again to look at that link between climate change, food production, and then health outcomes, for example, child stunting and wasting, and trying to identify that through the literature. So we're controlling for example, GDP and education and household size. We're controlling for weather and droughts. We change for interannual temperature changes, but also that anomaly of growth degrees. So growing degree days. So here we're starting to tease out and starting to find that there's we've got statistical significance for our SPI 6. That's a drought occurring during the growing season, and changes in temperature. And this has an impact on harvests. And there's a dual impact, one through food security, and then one food production, one direct into food insecurity. And I suppose if I'm trying to think sort of what's interesting for me sitting back and thinking about the policy implications, it's that if we look back at that definition of food insecurity, it's focusing on food being affordable and in the right place and at the right time, and being of the right sort of quality and culturally significant food. But here we're starting to see that the health outcomes are being directly affected by heat and food production in a specific country. And so that's starting to be worrying, because on the one hand, we know that an indicator of food insecurity is your dependence on imported food. So the more dependent you are on imports, the lower your food security. But now we're seeing that if you're dependent on domestic production, it's going to be harder again to achieve food security because of the impact of climate change in terms of changing rainfall patterns and temperature changes. And so it seems whether you're dependent on imports or whether you're dependent on domestic production, life is going to be a lot harder because of climate change. And so building resilience becomes particularly important. So, and looking forward, we can then take projections and again, start to sort of think of this as an early warning system in a way as to where we really need to be worried. So these are future projections that look at the likely impact of climate change on children underweight. And these, Shura is generating these for many different indicators of health. And we can sort of follow something like an RCP 4.5, which is actually a pretty moderate warming. It's about where we are now, I think, even post the Glasgow COP. And so we can see that even with an RCP of 4.5, that's moderate warming, we see the climate change having a negative impact on weight in children. And that's a bit worrying because, so much effort is being put into poverty reduction and building resilience, building prosperity in countries. And we can see that climate change is negating this impact. So what can we do with these data? Well, on the one hand, they contribute to the global discussion on mitigation. So this is quite a direct sort of illustration of the costs of climate change. So due to emissions, due to warming, we're worsening the health of children in low-income countries in particular. We can see it's the low-income countries where the harm is occurring. And so it sort of gives a bit more strength to arguments to mitigate. But also we can use it in terms of, like I was saying, sort of building resilience and starting to think about where do we really need to be worried that there's going to be most harm and most negating of those efforts to, to reach the SDGs. And I think if we think about the Sustainable Development Goals and efforts being made to achieve those, it's going to be all the harder with climate change. So I just wanted to add a little bit about, how we can sort of think about this. I've talked a little bit, about the idea that, there are trade-offs, that if you've got greater reliance on imports, you're at risk from systemic crisis. If you've got greater reliance on domestic production, you're at risk from localized climate shocks. And another area of work that I've sort of been looking with the colleagues is that, as there's more pressure for countries to grow more of their own food, to be more self-sufficient, and to be less dependent on these highly integrated, highly sensitive global markets that can be very unstable, as we saw in 2008, and to some extent in 2011 and 2012, these pressures can lead to agricultural expansion, which could well be at the expense of ecosystem services. And I'll allude to that a little bit later. But just in the final, I think I've got about 3 more minutes if I'm going to leave time for questions. So just in the final few minutes, I just wanted to sort of think about so what? So what for environmental economists? So what for the group of us that's gathered here today? And, the reason we're sort of part of Environment for Development. And I in a way, I leave it to you guys to answer the so what. People working in country, people working with their collaborators in country. But I just had a few. One is there's huge opportunities, I think, at the moment to collaborate with scientists using global data. Again, there'll be some people laughing in the audience who know me as a theorist who doesn't go near data normally, but I'm evolving. So I think there's great opportunities, and I've worked on several projects in projects, GCRF UK funded projects. Of course, they all got defunded when the UK cut its aid budget, but UK projects working in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Zambia, working on the Lancet Countdown that looks at the links between climate change and health, where there's a lot of different scientists there. And so, the scientists are starting to look at the impact of heat, for example, on crop yield potential. So, the scientists looking at the impact of heat on labor. And of course, the impact of heat on labor productivity is very important if your workforce, is working outside as agricultural laborers. I know Samanathan's done a lovely paper in JP on the impact on labor on sort of indoor manufacturing. So there's exciting opportunities there. Working in projecting futures. Again, there's great work to be done with the scientists. There's the data sets that my colleagues work with are things like the ERA 5 data set. I know some people, I think some people are sort of working with some of the global forest data as well. And then this collaboration with ecologists working on trade-offs of food versus biodiversity. I'll just show you an example of some work that's being done there. So that's at a sort of global secondary data level. There's huge opportunities there, and the data sets are great. There's also a wonderful data set that Shaw and I are working with at the moment, which is the FAO FIES data, the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. So this is another way of measuring food insecurity, and rather than the sort of original FAO data, which looks at the quantity of food, how much food, what are the calories, what's the variety. FIES asks people about their experiences of food insecurity. So whether they've had to miss a meal, whether they've had to go for a day without a meal, whether they can't have as much variety as they would like to have. And so that's a great data set. Again, it's secondary data. But I think there's great opportunities to work with local policymakers and local communities. And for example, using data to test policy interventions. So one of the things that we've been looking at is safety nets. And so to what extent cash versus food is a better safety net? And we can look in theory. And so the theory will tell us as economists that generally it's better to give people cash because they can optimize their utility in the way that works for them. But in practice, sometimes cash is better and sometimes food is better. And it partly depends on the functioning of markets. In the literature, you'll find that sometimes when people are given cash, interestingly, they don't use it to buy food, even though they're food insecure. They actually use it to pay off debts. People who are food insecure, they're probably also insecure in so many different types of poverties that actually being food insecure is not the worst thing in insecure. They might again have very high debts. And so giving people cash access, how they can improve their lives, and they may not choose. I'm just going to note saying my internet. I hope I've just got a couple more minutes, so I hope that doesn't stop me from talking. when I presented this work to policymakers in lower income countries, and I sort of say to them, so what? A lot of the discussion is agricultural interventions. So we're going back to, you know, may sound crop breeding, the kind of crops that are more resilient to climate change. So again, there's interventions on the resilience side for people, and there's interventions on the resilience side for crops. And then of course, there's health interventions. So if health is being harmed through food insecurity, there's interventions where you can reach mothers, where you can reach young children. So this is just, please don't tweet this, just in case anyone's tempted, because it's still in review. But again, this is the kind of work that I've been doing on a large project with IIED and other collaborators. And these data are from, if you recognize the maps, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia. But what we were looking at there is where cropland coincides with areas that are relatively rich in species. So if a country's starting to talk about increasing agricultural production, and if a country decides it wants through yield increases, but through expansion of agricultural area, it turns out that in many countries, cropland coincides with areas that are particularly rich in species. And so understanding trade-offs, I think, is going to be increasingly important as we're sort of pushing planetary boundaries in so many directions. And it becomes essential to work with ecologists and development specialists, and of course, a lot of fun. Now, it's harder to publish in the economics journals, and it's harder to publish in the environmental economics journals. It looks like Gunnar's about to cut me off, but these are really fun papers to work on. So there are the final thoughts that I've probably said already, and I think I should stop so there's time for questions. Thank you. I thought at this point someone was going to start talking if I shut up. Razak?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for this exciting presentation for this evening. Yeah, I can invite some questions. I already have 2-3 questions. That from Thomas Stenner. Yes, we have a question from Thomas Stenner, and it's a kind of comment. Making fuel out of crops was accused of stealing food from the poor and put it in the fuel tanks for the rich. On the other hand, biofuel could also be seen as providing opportunity to farmers in low-income countries to develop new goods, products, and income and employment opportunities. How do you think we could organize our thought around this area?
Oh, there's a tough one. Thanks, Thomas, for throwing that one at me straight away. I think this is part of a broader discussion, I think, you know, because quite honestly, whether it's growing biofuels to put in the tanks of the rich or growing fine green beans to put in the mouths of the rich in higher income countries, you know, there is that tension where, you know, some countries are increasing their growth through export-oriented crops, and it could be flowers, it could be foods, it could be biofuels. It's stuff that's going out the country. So on the one hand, you're raising incomes, which if we look at those measures of food insecurity, you can be reducing food insecurity through incomes. But there's less food availability. And I suspect that that is one of these pressures. And so certainly if you talk to policymakers, for example, in Zambia, there's a big push to increase food security. So there will be increase in crop area and cropping there. So I think, you know, on the one hand, biofuels have proven to be problematic in cars. And it's not clear that they're actually any more climate friendly than petrol and diesel. So that's a problem to start with. But I think we need really good data to begin with. And then probably we really just do need to understand the livelihoods. But you know, it's fine for me to stand here talking, but really I think it is about embedding these kind of research questions in country. I think that's why EfD is so strong. Because, you know, EfD has the researchers and the academics on the ground who can start to understand from the farmer perspective, from the policy perspective, from the community's perspective, what their preferences and choices are. And that's part of what some of the work I'm doing in Zambia and Ethiopia and Ghana is, that we start to talk to communities about those trade-offs where people are expanding crops, which could be for biofuel. But, you know, European countries have a lot to answer for, randomly putting on mandates for biofuels, randomly taking them off, and sort of, there's huge hysteresis costs, I think, for lower income countries. So I think lower income countries probably need to be much more in control of that dialogue.
All right. Guna, you have a question and you'd like to pose your question. Welcome, Guna. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for letting me in, Razak, and wonderful keynote, Liz. Thank you so much. So for a comment and a question, as they used to say. My comment first on the cash versus food for work. That happened to be my bachelor's thesis back in 1987 in Ethiopia after that famine, and it turned out exactly as you say. Using food is actually a built-in stabilizer, because the prices of, if you don't have any production locally, the prices go up. So if you give them cash, it won't, go anywhere anyway, right? In stopping the famine. So this is a iconic kind of question. Of course, thank you so much for this invitation. I've been trying for years to talk about this kind of broader approach to the cost of climate change, as a theme within EfD, because I think that we are set up exactly to do that. So I've never actually thought about it in terms of the food systems, but rather other direct shocks. So I would love to go away from this meeting with some even more concrete ideas about exactly how we could unravel that, because I think it's a beautiful idea and I would like to act on it. So just a few more words on that to make it real. Thanks.
So it's actually interesting. I think that, I think a lot of disciplines are coming to that question of attribution. So first of all, you need to attribute climate change to the outcomes, and then you try to put a cost on them. And so I've been doing a lot of work on the costs of climate change on health. And so, part of those costs are, the pressures, one, it's the cost to people and the pressures you're putting on health services. But I think it's an interesting discussion, because when I talk to scientists about attribution, they look at this and go, econometrics and attribution, they do it in a very different way. So I think one, it's teasing out that impact of climate change, for example, on food security. But then in terms of the cost, how do we attribute that as a cost? And I suppose, I'm not sure I've thought of it much more deeply than this. So maybe this is a conversation that we can have, with some EfD people who are interested in it. But it's, it's what is the cost that's being, I like the thumbs up. What is the cost that's being imposed on countries? And that might be, the cost, it could be the cost to health. So, that's one of the things. So that's why the work we're looking at, the food insecurity playing into child health. So it can just be the cost in terms of, lost years of health. But it could be the cost in terms of replacing that food. If you have to import the food that otherwise you'd be growing, or if you have to have, more expensive health services. So what would be the additional health requirements, service requirements you need? But honestly, Gunnar, you put me on the spot there. But I think when we actually talk about the cost, I'm sure there's some economists who will just find a number and put a number to it. And there's some people in the Lancet Countdown that do that. But I think for us being quite embedded, us EfD family, being quite embedded in country, I think defining what that cost is actually much more exciting, because it's like, what do we do about this? If we've got more child stunting, does that mean that in the long term, kids are just not going to fulfill their potential? Are they going to have more health costs in future life? And I think those are the true human costs of making it just much harder to reduce poverty and making it just much harder to build prosperity. So I would welcome a discussion where the cost is not just someone adding a number to QALYs or equivalent lives lost, but actually something about that pathway for economic development, and to enable low-income countries to actually transition to those low-carbon, high-prosperity economies, which it will just be made harder.
Thank you, Liz. We still have some couple questions. Here I have a question from Stephen Kramer, and the question is, how do you relate agriculture expansion against agriculture productivity, especially in developing countries, like including Tanzania?
It's quite interesting because there's a lot of studies that sort of explore, you know, what drives expansion versus intensification. And so, you know, the economics models are sort of relatively straightforward, that you sort of look at the cost of expanding and the cost of intensifying. And, you know, often you'll expand if the land is there and no one's really protecting it and it's relatively easy to clear or to cut the forest. And you'll intensify if there's no land to expand into or it's really highly protected. So, you know, somewhere like I was living in Ghana, and there, you know, there's very little agricultural expansion left because most of the agriculture has met the highly protected areas, and the areas that weren't protected enough have disappeared. And so, you know, there you actually don't, you know, the sort of agricultural expansion's almost stopped because there's not many forests left and they're well protected. So, but there's, but you know, there's concerns, of course, that it's Stevens paradox, isn't it? It's a few hundred years old, that one. But this idea that if you give farmers the ability to increase productivity, it doesn't necessarily stop expansion. It just makes expansion more profitable. So, you know, so this is where Liz, the person who always focused on forests, comes in. That, you know, if you really protect your forests and you contain the agriculture, then you can encourage that intensification of agriculture, and, you know, you can start to see your yields go up. But farmers aren't going to invest in like sort of high input, high output agriculture when there's high risk, and climate change is bringing yet more risk to farmers. So it's sort of almost more likely farmers are going to expand if there's fewer upfront costs, or, you know, they don't have to take on a loan, or they don't risk losing all their harvest and not being able to pay back the input costs. So I think those interactions between the and I just peeked down at another Stephen question to link to that, which yeah, Stephen, yeah, the problem definitely is agricultural productivity. I think one of the concerns is exactly that when you don't improve the productivity, the only option if you want more food is to expand. And so at least a starting point is, if you want to produce more food, you need to expand productivity. And in an era of climate change, that's really tough. And so that is where, you know, it's the irrigation and it's the breeding and it's the appropriate crops that are going to matter. And it's really going back to, for some of us, you know, I was trained as an agricultural economist, and I do feel I'm sort of going back to my ag econ roots. I'm having these discussions about food security, which I didn't think I would be. So I jumped into another question there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Liz. We still have some questions from Michael Tom. You talked about food insecurity related to import dependence, but I imagine this is not due to import dependence itself, but rather to the market and not to working as well. Any thought on addressing that?
Yeah, so thanks, Micah. So on the one hand, I took that because the FAO suite of food security indicators sticks in dependence on imports. But yes, it is the markets, and I think that's where the 2008 food crisis is quite interesting, because the markets, you could argue that on the one hand, markets are working better than ever. You know, the global food markets are highly integrated. Food is, you know, flowing back and forth. The price signals are working very well in general. But that's what makes systems these days so hyper vulnerable to human behavior. And so I think what we've got is highly functioning global markets, but that are very sensitive to shocks, and so they're actually very stable markets. So we could argue that we've gone from sort of more long-term stable markets that are less sensitive to these highly integrated markets that all of a sudden jump. And I think it's very like what we see in foreign exchange markets, you know, where the trigger a really massive change in the value of two currencies against each other, because the algorithms pick up on, if the price differential is increasing, that means it's going to increase more, so we hold back and sell later. And so I think, unfortunately, in part due to speculation and just in part due to normal, you know, it's normal human behavior, that if you think, you know, we do it in England all the time. We seem to, you know, just only a few months ago, no one could get fuel for their cars because there was a hint there might be a lack of fuel, so everyone filled their cars up. And then I think at the start of COVID, there was no toilet paper in shops in England because it was in everyone's bathrooms. So I think it's the fact that the markets actually need to be regulated a little bit more. And so that's why sort of countries coming together and talking about committing not to put export restrictions on, because signaling you're willing to put an export restriction on is a self-fulfilling prophecy. People have talked about having virtual storage and virtual reserves, but it's more about ensuring that when there's a trigger, that there's dampening can occur. And part of that is actually probably more storage, and probably regional storage. So sort of going back to where we were before markets were liberated and countries started getting rid of their strategic grain reserves.
Right, thank you. The last two questions from Nudin. How can we reconcile climate change and the trust in the market to alleviate poverty?
Gosh, yeah, look, I don't think, you know, I think neoclassical economists, or, you know, very, or let's say sort of a certain type of politician and individual who believes in the markets, you know, they'll sort of hold up Adam Smith and go, you know, we should let the invisible hand and let the markets take over, because, you know, markets will find an efficient price. But of course, you know, that's sort of Econ 101 is, you know, let's have hands off and let the markets sort things out and become efficient. But I think often people forget the second slide on Economics 101, which is, you know, the markets only work under some very, very strict conditions, you know, including no externalities, no monopolies, and I think when we look at the world today, it's very clear that as we push planetary boundaries, all our actions have externalities, and they might not have mattered 100 years ago, but goodness do they now. And, you know, climate change is a global public bad. And so there's no reason why we should believe that markets will work unless they're highly regulated. And, you know, climate change, well, we don't have a global dictator. That would have made life easy to start with. But I think it's really problematic when people still sort of do believe too much in the market, because I think capitalism is here to stay and the markets are here to stay, and that's fine, but they have to be much, much more regulated, recognizing that there are so many global public goods that are being harmed. And so, you know, I think to alleviate poverty, we need a lot of action and a lot of intervention. And whether that's, and in an era of climate change, you know, that's the higher income countries actually providing the climate finance necessary to allow lower income countries both to build their resilience and to transition to being low carbon economies.
Yeah, I think we're out of time, but maybe the last one from Jonas Alem. One of the mechanisms that climate change will affect food security through changing the diet composition of households. I mean, people substitute calorie-rich foods for nutrition foods, veggie, fruits, etc. Any insight for future research on this?
Jonas probably has more insights than I do. I think dietary changes are really important. I think, you know, on the one hand, as people get richer, you know, they can afford a change in diet. As people urbanize more, you know, they might be tempted to eat more sort of processed food. But I think, and as climate change comes in, I think it's both one, the kind of foods people might be choosing, but also looking at what crops are actually more resilient to climate change. So, you know, if we look at global production, we're so highly dependent on a small number of grains. And so maybe building resilience to climate change will link to people sort of starting to need to eat a greater variety of grains and a greater variety of fruits and vegetables. I'm not sure if I'm answering your questions, but I think in terms of future research, I think that is where some of these sort of, you know, not relying on secondary data, but actually working in country to try to understand how people's diets are changing and what that means in terms of local production and what that means in terms of, you know, imported foods. So what's being produced in country, and is the variety sufficient there? But I think certainly the issue of nutrition, because climate change itself is changing the nutritional value of foods. And so it looks like the warming and particularly the carbon dioxide fertilization in the air is actually reducing the nutritional value of some foodstuffs. So and there's an example, I think, where, you know, we can work with nutritionists. So again, an opportunity for economists to understand why people make the food choices they do, linked with nutritionists talk about the nutritional value of that food, linked to the agricultural scientists and economists talk about what food's available and what food might be better to be grown. So I probably haven't answered your question, but I think it's a nice one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. Great presentation, and thank you, participants, for this session. And I think this comes to the end of our plenary today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.